pretty wrecked, which is why people come here. There's our driver. Start her up, Mike.
You guys want to get together for a big old group shot?
Yeah, we can do that.
Can I take pictures? That'd be great.
The Falater family is living in Arizona. Scott Falater is a successful engineer. He's working at Motorola. Yarmila Falater pretty much is in charge of the kids.
It's not on.
Yes, it is.
Michael is 12. He's your typical boy. And then you have Megan Falater. She's 15. Scott and Yarmila have been happily married for over 20 years, and Scott calls her Yarm for short.
Tierra Bueno, that's Spanish for good land. It's a residential neighborhood, middle class. Northeast Phoenix at that time had a reputation to be a very safe, quiet community.
We don't usually respond there. It's not a high crime area we normally work.
My name's Michael Falater. My father is Scott Falater. In 1997, I was 12 years old. My father was hard at work. He was a product engineer for Motorola. Religion was always important in my family. We were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was teaching early morning seminary, so he would wake up and he'd be teaching the seminary at 6:15. He'd drive my sister to school, and then he would drive to work, and he'd usually be home for dinner. January 16th, it was a typical Thursday for my family. I recall having family dinner.
After dinner, I went and worked on the computer to prepare for the next day's church class. And then the kids went to bed at 9 o'clock.
It's been a long day at work. He's prepping for his religious education class, and now his wife wants him to go fix the pool filter at 9 in the evening. That is a very long day.
She was deathly afraid of the thing turning green on us. And so I went out to try to work on the pool filter. The O-ring was so old and kind of stuck.
And he tries to dig it out of the pool pump, and he's not able to get it all out. It's now closer to 9:30 or so at night. Not a lot of light. He's frustrated. I'm just going to give up and go to sleep.
Where am I going?
To radiology. We're going to take some x-rays.
My wife was asleep on the couch with ER on television, and I woke her up and kissed her goodnight, apologized for not fixing the pool filter, told her I'd get to it the next day, and went to bed myself. I was really exhausted and crashed in bed. I would guess it was between 9:30 and 10 o'clock.
Greg Coons and Stephanie Reedhead live next door to the Falaters.
Greg and I were getting ready to go to bed somewhere a little after 10, probably 10:30. And then I heard moaning or crying or something. And then I told Greg, I think it was something outside. We just really didn't want to be nosy neighbors or be, eavesdropping. But Greg thought, hopefully this isn't something bad happening. And so he went and looked over the wall.
What the neighbor sees is a body of Yarmila Falater just lying there. He thinks that maybe this is someone who's just drunk and passed out. Some time passes, and Scott then comes out onto their backyard. He then grabs her by the arms, over her head, and drags her to the edge of the pool. He then seems to roll her body into the pool.
We thought he was splashing her and trying to wake her up. And then I remember Greg running in. Oh my God, he put her head underwater. She's in the pool, but now he's actually holding her head under the water.
What is your emergency? I don't know. My neighbors, there was a bunch of yelling and screaming going on. I looked over the fence, and the husband just threw, I believe, the wife into the pool, and looked like he's holding her underwater. All right, I'll get somebody out there. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, my biggest concern was just to get there as quickly as I can to hopefully prevent it. It was life or death situation, and time was of the essence.
Police officer, my front yard. Okay, can you talk with the officers?
Officer Stanowitz arrived on scene. We went over the wall.
The suspect at the time was unaccounted for. We did not know where he was at. I had no idea how dangerous he was. You know, was this an ambush situation? So just high amount of adrenaline.
I saw Yarmel floating in the pool. Officer Stanowitz began to tend to her and pull her out of the pool.
You know, just looking at the water, it was like a light pinkish color, so I knew it was bad. And as soon as I picked her up and saw the water go dark red, you know, that's when my heart did sink.
I've never seen a shark attack in person, but to me, it was reminiscent of a shark attack.
Sergeant Stanowitz, he was addressing Yarmila Falater, and that's when I first saw Scott Falater. I saw him from outside. I approached the Arcadia glass door that was partially open.
We stepped in, and from what I recall, almost immediately I recognized Scott Falater at the top of the stairs, wearing a crisp white t-shirt, red flannel pajamas, and he made remarks to the extent of, "What's going on? What are you doing in my house? Why are you here?"
I was just hopelessly confused at first. I kept asking what is going on. All they would do is yell, "Get down," you know, "Shut up, get down."
I pointed the gun, I had a gun pointed at him, and I was yelling at him to show me his hands and to get on the ground. I holstered my gun and I handcuffed him.
They asked me how many people were in the house.
He told us 4. We asked him who, and he said it was his family, his wife, 2 kids, and himself. Well, at that point, I had observed his wife in the swimming pool when I jumped over the back wall. So that surprised me.
I heard an Officer Layden, you know, yelling and giving verbal commands. At that point, I checked her pulse, you know, both on her neck, both on her wrist, and I wasn't getting anything with the amount of blood. I knew that she was gone.
105, 1025.
As I laid there, I could hear people talking, and I could tell from their conversations that Yarm was out in the backyard hurt, and that they were working on her.
Took him out to the patrol car to secure him in the back of the patrol car.
Then it came to sweeping the house, and that's when I learned of Michael Falater and Megan Falater asleep in their rooms upstairs, and they were still asleep.
Thank God they were fine. They were untouched, unscathed.
The next thing I recall is a police officer waking me up sometime very early in the morning, telling me that my parents had gotten in a fight and had a disagreement. I thought that was all odd because I had never seen my parents fight or argue.
I was concerned about their welfare and their mental state and trying to protect them as much as possible and minimize what they have to see or hear at that moment in time.
We went out the front door. At that point, a police officer came to my sister and I and said that during the argument, my mother died. And then that police officer walked away. I went to bed as a 12-year-old kid with a happy life, and I woke up to a police officer telling me that my mother had died. And it's everything that you think it would be and more.
After Scott's arrested, he's taken downtown for one of the oddest and shortest interrogations we're used to seeing. And believe it or not, police will focus on a Band-Aid.
Know where the Band-Aid came from?
All right, please.
Our next witness will be the defendant, Scott Falater. Scott, did you knowingly kill your wife?
No, not at all. I couldn't knowingly kill her. No one deserved it less of anyone that I know than her.
The prosecutor, Juan Martinez, seized on a remark made in the notes of a psychologist who'd interviewed Scott Falater in jail.
See that up there?
Yes, I do.
A phrase Scott used during their conversation.
It does say unforgivable sin, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Juan made the biggest thing out of this, that somehow Yarmila had committed some kind of a horrible something suggesting unfaithfulness by Yarmila. And he kept trying to grind on that to make that a motive.
When you say unforgivable sin, it suggests that she had cheated on Scott Falater. But that's really not the case, is it?
I'm not suggesting that anybody committed the sin of adultery. I can't get into Mr. Falater's head and look to see what he considered to be an unforgivable sin. It is his phrase.
So when you uttered the word unforgivable sin, what did you mean?
I felt that perhaps I had committed the unforgivable sin by killing Yarm.
During the 6-week trial, the jury heard testimony from 52 witnesses. 180 court exhibits were marked and put into evidence. But it took only 8 hours of deliberations before the jurors sent word to the judge they had a verdict.
We, the jury, duly impaneled and sworn in the above entitled action, upon our oaths do find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree.
It was a traumatic moment for all of us.
Steve, ready?
Yes,
Judge Reinstein had to decide whether or not the death penalty was going to be imposed for Scott Falater.
I accept the responsibility that it was I that killed her. I'm certainly sorry for the pain that Yarm must have felt that night.
In the end, he was sentenced to life in prison.
Recording all the cameras. They wanted us to record the cameras.
And we're just waiting for them
Yes, to let us in.
to let us in. Got it. This is Scott Falater today, serving that life sentence in an Arizona prison. Have your thoughts changed at all about what you believe happened that night?
I cannot swear on a stack of Bibles that I was sleepwalking. All I can say is I do not know what happened. I understand the trauma and the suffering that this whole thing caused, and it's on me. Hey, Mike.
Hey, how are you, Dad? He's still my dad, and I hope to always have that relationship with him, whether he's in prison or he's out.
You know what I miss was when we would go out on Christmas Eve and buy stuff for Mom. Remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, I miss that stuff. Being out, just being with you guys.
Yeah.
20 years later, when I think of Scott Falater, it is still a complete and total mystery to me as to what the hell happened that night.
I can't tell you for sure whether the man was asleep or not.
I think we all have a sense that we are capable of performing as human beings acts of great dignity and occasionally acts of great violence. And Scott Falater was a figure capable of both.
I accept the fact that the neighbors saw me do the physical act. Would I have consciously and intentionally killed her? Absolutely not.
In 1999, almost 2 years after Yarmila's murder,
The stories that touch your life. This is 2020.
2020 producer Janice Tomlin and correspondent Connie Chung went to Arizona to cover the Falater story as Scott was awaiting trial.
The kids wanted to visit their father, and that visit was set up. And we were allowed to be there for it.
How are things going?
I missed English and biology, but I think that's okay.
And it was through glass.
Oh,
Okay.
love you, sweetheart.
I can't imagine how difficult that was for them.
Bye.
We wanted to interview the kids because they were the other two people in that house. We wanted to see if they could shed any light at all on why what happened.
After you went to bed at 9 o'clock, what was the next thing you remember?
Waking up at around 1:30.
Why did you wake up?
A police officer came and woke me up.
They were resigned to the fact that their mom was gone, but they were desperate to try to save their dad. I mean, that was the only parent they had left.
Michael, are you aware of the fact that if your father is convicted of first-degree murder, that the prosecutor could ask for the death penalty.
Yeah.
Have you prepared in your mind for that prospect?
Not really.
I can't see my father killing my mother intentionally. That is not like my father. My father was not a violent person. They never argued. It doesn't jive with what I remember about my childhood.
Do you love your wife?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I loved her a great deal. She was my best friend.
If any two people were meant for each other from the very beginning, it was those two.
Scott Falater was born in the Chicago area.
Scott was never much of a kid that went out on dates, but he saw Yarmila at school, in high school.
Yarmila remembered that one of the things that first charmed her about Scott Falater was that he would fall asleep during English class, that he had a habit of dozing off during the middle of the day.
And he decided that that's the one he liked, so he asked her to go out, and that was the first date for him, and he never went out with anybody else after that.
In his entire life?
No, he never did.
I married her at age 20, and she's been there for me my entire adult life.
They were both Catholic. They were both raised Catholics. And sometime before they married, Scott came across some missionaries for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and he converted to that church.
Then she actually became a Mormon, and they certainly lived a Mormon existence with her family.
In June of 1981, Scott and Yarmila started their family with daughter Megan, and 3 years later, Michael was born.
She was an excellent mother, real fantastically devoted to the kids. When our second was born, she gave up her career to be a stay-at-home mom.
Scott Falater and Yarmila Falater moved to Phoenix because of his job. They became involved in the LDS community, which is fairly sizable here in Arizona.
Scott Falater works as an engineer at Motorola, and he's a successful engineer. He's a product manager in charge of a computer chip.
In the late 90s, Motorola is a telecommunications giant. They're the ones leading the way manufacturing those early flip phones.
You spies should carry the Motorola StarTAC cellular phone, if I recall alert.
Yarmila never expressed any dissatisfaction with her marriage. And I would say, come on, Yarmila, there's got to be something that drives you nuts, you know? And she would just say, no, he's just a really great guy.
I had a father that worked hard and supported the family, and a stay-at-home mom who was always there when I came home from school. It was a very loving home.
One of the most popular places in Arizona to visit is Sedona, Arizona. It's beautiful with red rocks. The Falater family meet up with their extended family members from California in Sedona, Arizona, and they take what's called a pink Jeep tour.
Woo-hoo! I see this drop off.
Do you remember that trip, Michael?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
I remember me and Dad having a lot of fun, just like getting bounced around in the Jeep.
Michael Falater described that day as one of the most fun days in his life. This just was weeks before his mother was murdered.
This male next door threw his wife in the pool, and now he's holding her down underwater.
Scott and Yarmila's happy marriage and their happy family life shattered by a tragedy. It's a tragedy that the neighbor actually witnesses.
You see it, thanks.
And he tells his story to the jurors on the stand.
He is grabbing hold of her head, holding it under the water.
The trial was a sensation. It drew an incredible amount of interest, not because of the crime itself, but because of Scott Falater's defense.
There is a defense strategy that sounds at first like the plot of a science fiction movie.
Not to sound flippant, but I kind of smirked. I'm like, are you kidding me? Sleepwalking?
You do realize how unbelievable this defense sounds.
Of course I do. Of course I do. I sort of feel like an idiot sitting here talking about it, and I sure wouldn't be if I didn't think it was true.
Authorities say Scott Falater stabbed his wife over and over and then held her head underwater. But in a bizarre twist, he is not denying it.
You have to know and intend to kill somebody to be guilty of murder. And he was in an unconscious state when he killed her and therefore was not guilty of the crime.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. It is a high-profile trial that's already received national attention, and it's set to begin in just about an hour. Scott Falater will go before a jury that will decide whether he should be convicted in the death of his wife.
Why are you asking for the death penalty? Here's a man who did not have a criminal record.
We need to focus on the victim at some point. This is a woman who suffered for approximately 15 minutes at the hands of her husband.
But Mr. Martinez, are you ready to proceed with your opening statement at this time? Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Juan Martinez was known as a bulldog prosecutor who had never lost a murder case.
Juan came out, gun blazing.
Good afternoon to all of you. This individual here, the defendant, Scott Falater, in a sense, baptized his wife, Yarmila Falater, into the afterlife. And it all started at about 10 o'clock in the evening in one of the remote areas, one of the darker areas of their backyard next to the pool pump. I wanted them to believe that this is something that he wanted to happen. This is something that wasn't a mistake. Your name, sir?
I'm Philip Earl King, MD. I'm the chief medical examiner.
The medical examiner testified that Yarmila Falater had 44 stab wounds. Most of them were defensive wounds, but some were fatal.
And with regard to these 44 wounds that we've been talking about, the 44 include the cuts to the hand, correct?
Yes, they do.
Based on what the medical examiner told us about the stab wounds, we believe that once he had her near the pool pump, he actually put his left arm around her mouth so that she wouldn't scream. Then he loped his right arm around her shoulder and began to stab her. She knew what was going on around her, but she could not do anything about it.
This is the left side of the neck.
The day that the medical examiner showed all the pictures of him, that tore me apart. I saw the very first picture and I couldn't take any more. And spent however long it lasted just looking at the table in front of me. I could not look up. I don't want to remember your arm that way.
If you're sitting in the courtroom hearing the evidence, it's very hard to get past anybody stabbing someone else 44 times, much less, husband stabbing his wife 44 times. And then he had his bombshell witness, the next door neighbor, Greg Coons.
And who are the neighbors to the city?
Scott and Yarmila Falater.
And drawing your attention back to January 16th of 1997.
Based on his testimony, he did not see the initial attack.
I saw a person laying on the ground, head towards the house, feet towards the pool equipment. My impression was that she was drunk.
There wasn't any evidence presented by anybody as to how the two of them got outside and how the scenario was that he ended up stabbing her. Greg's eyewitness testimony is he did not see the stabbing. He looked over the fence and he was able to see a woman on the pool deck. And then he saw lights going on and off in the house.
The next thing, the light was on upstairs, that window up top, which is the master bedroom. And Mr. Falater appeared through that and walked through my field of view.
The prosecution is trying to make the case that Scott is wide awake, fully conscious, and doing a series of tasks in the minutes after the attack on his wife.
He came out of the bathroom, shut the light off, walked through the bedroom, shut the light off, and then went downstairs to the kitchen. So what do you see him doing in the kitchen, if anything?
The next time I see him, he's walking from the kitchen back into the living room, and it looks like he's wringing his hands.
He started sort of doing this with his hands in a washing motion. And as he walked towards the Arcadia door, opened the sliding door all the way.
Greg testifies that he sees Scott putting on gloves as he approaches Yarmila's body lying next to the pool.
Did he actually have them on, or was he pulling them on?
One hand was already on. He was pulling on the other.
Then what happens?
He moved her legs around to the side. He knelt down behind her and pushed her into the water.
That's not enough for him. So what he does is he actually then leans sort of into the pool with the gloves that he has on, holds her head and sticks it down in the water. Then he goes upstairs. And the police, of course, come out.
Greg Coons was the bombshell witness because Scott said he had zero idea how any of this happened. You had one person who was able to testify, this is what I saw. And a lot of the things that Greg Coons saw were damning.
Now let me take you to 1996.
We didn't dispute the fact that he was the one that stabbed her 44 times. And it was perplexing. Why did this happen?
They consider themselves to be each other's best friends.
I mean, even as reporters, we try to find narratives or through lines as to why a murder would take place. And here there really wasn't a motive, a reason. These were two high school sweethearts who had been married for 20 years, raised two kids from the outside. There was nothing here to suggest any trouble.
And there's absolutely no history, any kind of violence or abuse from either side in this particular family. All you know about are two people that were devoted to one another and loved one another. And that's why this whole thing is such a senseless act.
After Yarmila Falater is murdered, Scott's family is totally bewildered. This is not their mild-mannered, non-violent son or brother, until they remember that Scott used to sleepwalk as a child.
And she said, I just picked her up and threw her across the kitchen. I don't remember that incident at all either.
In the early summer months of 1999, about 2.5 years after the killing, Scott Falater's facing the death penalty in a crime that he says he committed, but he's not responsible for.
In Phoenix this morning, testimony resumes in the bizarre murder trial of Scott Falater. An otherwise mild-mannered engineer, Falater admits stabbing his wife 44 times and then holding her head underwater in their swimming pool until she died. But faced with first-degree murder charges, this father of two insists he's not guilty.
Juan Martinez had a pretty slam dunk case. He had an eyewitness.
I saw a person laying on the ground.
He had damning evidence.
And everyone in the courtroom is wondering what on earth will Scott Falater's defense be?
I didn't see what our defense was going to be. We know he did it. And then the question was, what caused it?
When we first went in and met the attorney, he had been planning to plead Scott as guilty but mentally insane.
What did you think of that?
Oh, I was outraged. I was outraged. I said, my brother is not an insane person. There's no way you could prove that he's insane.
Scott's mother and sister are racking their brains trying to figure out what went wrong. How could this be? When they remember that Scott used to sleepwalk as a child.
As I sat and thought about it, I remembered several instances where he did walk in his sleep. And I mentioned that to Laura.
So I got on the internet and got as much information together as I could before I meet with the attorney. And didn't talk to Scott about this at all, mostly because we wanted to be sure that this was a certain possibility, because it sounded so ridiculous.
I was willing to consider it. Then you wanted to know, did he have a history where there was sleepwalking? And Scott did.
There were several times he came down the stairs, fully dressed, and walked into the living room, and he was all ready for school, and it was like midnight. Then one time he came down the stairs, and he was probably over 15 or 16, and he was stark naked. And the next day, you'd ask him about it or talk to him about it, he had absolutely no idea that this happened.
And it was kind of a family joke. It wasn't any big deal. But his sister recalled a time he was violent during a sleepwalking episode.
I was 20 years old, just a month or so before I was getting married. I was going through finals in college, and I guess it was a stressful time.
He went to bed early that night. I stayed up. I was watching The Tonight Show.
Are you really applauding me or the fact that you don't live in Buffalo?
And he came walking out kind of behind me. And I said, Scott, what are you doing? He didn't answer me. And then he started walking toward the back door.
She thought, oh, he's sleepwalking. So she ran in front of him to lock the door leading out from the kitchen to the outside.
When I did that, I brushed against his shoulder, and he turned around and he grabbed me by my shoulders and just tossed me.
And she said, I just picked her up and threw her across the kitchen. I don't remember that incident at all.
He looked just so angry. He looked almost demonic. He just was, I have never seen him look like that, never.
Was that the only time you can remember Scott being violent with you or anyone?
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah. It was about 2 months before he and Yarm were gonna get married. He was getting ready for either midterms or finals at school. He was under a lot of stress. He just looked really tired. He would get circles around his eyes.
Experts don't know exactly what causes an episode in those prone to sleepwalking, but almost all sleep experts agree that stress and sleep deprivation can trigger sleepwalking episodes in those with sleep disorders.
My father's job at the time that my mother passed, he was working on a product for Motorola. He had a team of engineers, and I think he had come to the conclusion that the product wasn't going to succeed and that they might have to just scrap it and start over and start somewhere new.
And he was extremely concerned about how this would affect the well-being of his crew, of his staff.
He had a seminary class he was teaching 6 in the morning. He was spread very thin.
The defense tried to say that this was not Scott Falater acting consciously, that this was a monster emerging from the depths of his unconscious, an irrational, inexplicable eruption of a man who had come under enormous pressure, that his life had become a pressure cooker.
Sleepwalking is triggered by stress when a person can be under a great deal of stress, and it can also be triggered by sleep deprivation when you're very tired or just worn out.
I never bought the defense of killing while he was, sleepwalking or asleep.
Not to sound flippant, but I kind of smirked. I'm like, are you kidding me? Sleepwalking?
The actions during an episode are often illogical and somewhat nonsensical.
Really? This is kind of like almost hand in the cookie jar type thing. You got caught, dude.
The behavior isn't voluntary without intent.
And I just thought, nah, it's a bunch of bull.
The level of consciousness is impaired. The evidence is also clear that he was the one that stabbed her. But he did it without any conscious thought. He did it without awareness because he was sleepwalking.
From Times Square in New York, Diane Sawyer and Charles Gibson.
Good evening and welcome to 2020 Wednesday.
The case is big news. 2020 actually devoted multiple segments to it.
Well, what do you think of this as a defense strategy for killing a spouse? An Arizona man set out to convince a jury that he stabbed his wife 44 times while sleepwalking and doesn't remember a thing.
It got a lot of attention. It was a front page story. People were talking about it because it required and was based upon an attempt to penetrate the mysteries of the human mind and the privacy of an American family that apparently was living the American dream.
The jury was faced with an astonishing question. Did Scott Falater kill his wife in his sleep?
Scott himself initially said he thought that that was a crazy notion.
Inside, I just felt it was a bunch of BS. It was just very simple and pure BS, and it had no basis in reality. I'm an engineer. I knew there were tests that could be done in a hospital which would prove it with numbers. And so I was going to wait for those tests, which would tell me for sure.
See what happens when Scott goes to sleep with a camera watching.